This is a special production of ABC News.
For over 200 years, Americans have chosen leaders with an astonishing variety of personal style. We've picked the educated and the rough and ready, the wealthy and the self-made man. Some were eager to lead. Others forced themselves out of a sense of obligation. A few were truly beloved. Others lost their connection to us. And some still remain an enigma. But how well do we really understand the minds and hearts of these men who, for a brief time in history, we called Mr. President? On April 30th, 1989, New Yorkers witnessed a reenactment of George Washington's inauguration. It was on this spot, 200 years earlier, that presidential style was born.
I do solemnly swear that I will execute the office of the President.
And while all presidents, from George Washington to George Bush, pledged the same oath, each has left behind his own unique legacy of style.
Protect and defend the Constitution of the United States.
So help me God.
So help me God.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
The way a president walks and talks, works and plays, deals with the press and mixes with the public are all part of his personal style. And in the age of television, we often get a close-up and unadorned view. With the rapid advance of communications in the last 30 years, we've become much more aware of presidential style. Our presidents, once safe behind the White House doors, have come under the ever-increasing scrutiny of the public. No longer the remote, elevated figures of the past. We tend to see them more as human beings, with human problems. In recent years, presidents have been made and broken by television. These days, presidential hopefuls are trained in media style, for they know that in the world of the 30-second soundbite, the way you say something is almost as important as what you say. Of course, presidential style didn't begin with television. George Washington's style would set standards for all future presidents. Described as little short of divine, Washington was careful not to appear too much like a king. Some wanted to call him His Excellency, but Washington insisted on the less regal Mr. President. You might have thought that the stately George Washington would have played well on television. But according to Doris Goodwin, a political analyst and historian, he would have had one big problem.
The problem for George Washington today would obviously be every time he sat in one of those debate platforms and tried to smile to look pleasant, those ill-fitting wooden teeth would have probably popped around a little bit, making his smile less than pleasant.
Washington, though accused by some of being stuffy, had a natural presence that demanded respect. He would be a hard act to follow. In President's competence and intelligence, it was his prickly personality that was the problem. Adams himself once said,
"I am obnoxious, suspected, and unpopular."
There would be more like him. But the third president was a different breed. Thomas Jefferson brought a new sense of informality to the White House. He even greeted foreign diplomats in his slippers. A musician, architect, writer, and inventor, it seemed he could do anything. Well, almost anything.
Thomas Jefferson had such a high, squeaky voice that even he decided that he wouldn't speak in person before the Congress after a while because he knew it was such a weakness that he had.
James Madison was so short he was almost a dwarf. Always wearing black, he was once described as a schoolmaster dressed for a funeral. But what James lacked in style, his wife Dolly made up in dazzling social elegance. Her skilled hospitality smoothed many a quarrel for the president. James Monroe was the last of the Revolutionary Fathers. With his ancient attire and courtly manner, he seemed a relic from the past. A visitor once described him this way.
Balding, watery-eyed, and ink-stained.
They called John Quincy Adams hard as a piece of granite and cold as a lump of ice. His one indulgence, swimming nude in the Potomac River. Compared to the prim and proper Adams, Andrew Jackson was crude and boisterous. His inauguration was more like a barroom brawl than a presidential ceremony, but Old Hickory was the first people's president. And while intellectuals called him a barbarian, he was loved by the common man. Not so with Martin. You'd have been accused of Van Burenism, or poor. William Henry Harrison's was lethal. On his wintry inauguration day, he droned on in the freezing rain for 2 hours. He died of pneumonia a month later. That made John Tyler the first vice president to take the presidency upon the death of an incumbent. Tyler shocked all of Washington when he married a woman 30 years younger than he. Next was James Polk, a cold, formal president with a highly suspicious nature. A contemporary of Polk put it this way:
The man drinks too much water.
Old Zach Taylor, the unpretentious, sure-shot tobacco spitter, was the polar opposite of Polk. Loved by the people as a hero of the Mexican War, old Zach had simple tastes and a courteous, soft-spoken manner. Taylor's replacement, above all, hopelessly mediocre. But his wife did install the first bathtub in the White House. Franklin Pierce was a charmer, but his presidency was marked by his own inactivity. Although a religious man, he refrained from using the Bible at his inauguration, choosing instead to swear. James Buchanan was the only president never to marry. Fastidious and obsessed with precision, he once refused a check for $15,000 because it was off by 10 cents. Abraham Lincoln was a deep and serious thinker, but he was also one of the greatest storytellers in American history. The press didn't always like it, but Lincoln used anecdotes and humor to make points and respond to criticism. Accused once of being two-faced, Lincoln responded,
I leave it to you. If I had 2 faces, do you think I'd be walking around with this one?
Today, we honor Lincoln as an inspired leader, and we remember him as a spellbinding speaker. But how would Lincoln have done in the age of television?
Yes, it almost was handsome. He had a voice that was so high-pitched that people say it sounded like the whine of a wild dog. He had a frontier lingo that said there and here and thar instead of what we normally would say. All of those mannerisms, in addition to jabbing his finger every time he spoke, if we didn't know him, I think would make it very hard for us to develop an initial attachment to this tall, bearded, very difficult-speaking man.
Andrew Johnson, a tailor by trade, was the only president to make his own clothes, his 4 years in office. Ulysses S. Grant may be the original Teflon president. Though his administration was fraught with scandal, the mild-mannered Civil War general was a popular folk hero throughout his life. It was prayer in the morning, religious hymns at night, and never, ever any tobacco or liquor in the White House. A glum guest at a White House.
Would like champagne.
The next president, James Garfield, tried to please everyone, but found he couldn't. He was killed by a disgruntled man who wanted a job in the State Department and didn't get it. The Prince of Hospitality, fine food, drink, weakness. They say Chester Arthur never did today what he could put off till tomorrow. In contrast, the short, stubby Grover Cleveland was a workaholic, but he was also a huge eater who traveled with a fast crowd. And though he kept it from the public, he fathered an illegitimate child. Cleveland was the only. The man in between was Benjamin Harrison, the grandson of William Henry Harrison. Ben was calm and dignified as a public speaker, but on a one-to-one basis, he was a cold fish. William McKinley was just the opposite. He had a memory for faces and a personal style that turned enemies into friends. Hands with a crowd of voters in Buffalo. That opened up the presidency to a totally new phenomenon by the name of Theodore Roosevelt. A man of energy and action, Roosevelt had already become famous as the leader of the Rough Riders in the Spanish-American War. This president loved a good fight, and he used his bully pulpit to attack the rich trust companies, which he called malefactors of great wealth. A champion of the common man, Roosevelt became the most popular president in history. His inaugural was the first to be so fully documented on film, and it was a gala affair. Perhaps no president before or since has filled the presidency with as much vitality as Teddy Roosevelt. Certainly not his successor, William H. Taft. Taft couldn't remove 350 pounds. He had... Woodrow Wilson believed he was predestined to be president, and his sacred mission to bring peace to the world. Cameron made the Treaty of Versailles. Though everyone was glad to see the war end, the somber Wilson left people cold. His handshake was later described as a 10-cent pickle wrapped in a brown paper bag. Warren Harding was possibly the worst public speaker ever to hold office. The former newspaperman insisted on writing his own speeches, even though he had no sense of style or grammar. Progression, he once said, is not proclamation nor palaver. It is not of personal pronouns nor perennial pronouncement. But at least Harding was trying. Calvin Coolidge was virtually inactive. They say he slept 11 hours a day, and when he died, writer Dorothy Parker quipped, "How can they tell?" Herbert Hoover presided over the Depression and didn't cheer anybody up with his hopeful claims that prosperity is right around the corner. The next president took a different approach.
The only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
Franklin Delano Roosevelt was the first real media president. His personal strength and warmth came through in his radio fireside chats and guided a frightened nation through the Depression and World War II.
I cite as another example, a Vietnamese carrier had been located and sunk.
Roosevelt also appeared regularly in newsreels where his personal style could be seen as well as heard. Even severe personalities like Joseph Stalin eventually relaxed around him. Roosevelt, a victim of polio, spent much of his presidency in leg braces and a wheelchair, although he never allowed reporters to photograph him that way. He rarely spoke of his condition, but he did so in this newsreel.
I hope that you will pardon me for an unusual posture of sitting down during the presentation of what I want to say, but I know that you will realize that it makes it a lot easier for me in not having to carry about 10 pounds of steel round on the bottom of my legs.
FDR was the only president elected 4 times. Some say he's the closest we've ever come to having a king. Compared to FDR, Harry Truman seemed like the guy next door. The feisty Midwesterner and former clothier was one of the sharpest dressers in presidential history. But in the election of 1948, he was the underdog. The press predicted he'd be beaten by his rival, Thomas Dewey. But the underdog turned out to be a bulldog.
It was 11 o'clock the next morning before Dewey conceded, and later the president attended a victory dinner. He mimicked a radio commentator and he brought down the House.
And we are very sure that when the country vote comes in, Mr. Truman will be defeated by an overwhelming.
Harry Truman proved to be a decisive, straightforward president, handling the problems of the day in his typical bulldog fashion.
I for president, I for president, I for president, I for president. You like I like I. Everybody likes I.
With war hero status, they said no one could have beaten Dwight D. Eisenhower in 1952. The amiable, easygoing Ike had a contagious smile and was the first president to campaign on his, well, likability.
You like I like I. Everybody likes I for president. Hang out the banner, beat the drum. We'll take Ike to Washington.
But Ike proved to be a somewhat aloof president, with an indirect leadership style that some said made him invisible. Presidential style took a new turn in 1960 with the arrival of Senator John Fitzgerald Kennedy from Massachusetts. Together with his beautiful wife Jacqueline, Kennedy offered America a new sense of possibility and youthful determination.
That I will be worthy of your trust, who will carry the fight to the people in the fall, and we shall win.
He would be helped by the new medium of television, which was perfectly suited to Kennedy's calm, confident style. In a series of nationally televised debates, his poise and intelligent tone seemed to outclass his nervous opponent, Richard Nixon.
As the Gallup poll showed, is because the Soviet Union made a breakthrough in outer space. Mr. George Allen, head of your information service, has said that that made the people of the world begin to wonder whether we were first in science. We're first in other areas of science, but in space, which is the new science, we're not first.
Kennedy didn't win the election by much, and he knew that to be successful as president, he'd have to increase his popular support. The key would be visibility, and he'd start by showing off his family.
every degree of mind and spirit that I possess will be devoted to the long-range interests of the United States and to the cause of freedom around the world. So now my wife and I prepare for a new administration and for a new baby. Thank you.
America's new first family seemed the stuff of storybook dreams, attractive, wealthy, and at the pinnacle of physical and political power. For a brief time, they were regarded this image as a devoted family man, and only after his death would stories about marital difficulties between the president and his wife begin to emerge. Another image projected by JFK was one of physical vitality and vigor. Although sickly since childhood and hampered by a bad back, Kennedy looked the part of a healthy, robust sportsman, and this gave him a fresh appeal. He also had a strong speaking style, which could at times be inspiring.
Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike that the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans.
His inaugural speech is hailed as one of the greatest in history. In it, Kennedy borrowed a line from one of our poorest presidential speakers, Warren Harding, proving that the way you say something can make all the difference.
Ask not what your country can do for you.
At 43, Kennedy was the youngest elected president in history and the first to be born in the 20th century. He wanted to prove that he wasn't an inexperienced lightweight, and his solution was, again, visibility. He was the first president to hold live, nationally televised news conferences.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
Where he quickly demonstrated a firm grasp of the issues.
Good afternoon. Won't you be seated?
Flights of American aircraft have been suspended since May 1960. I have ordered that they not be resumed.
Polls soon showed a 91% approval rating of Kennedy's television style. His strategy of being a highly visible, involved president was working.
Newspaper reports, and I feel there would be more.
Kennedy traveled extensively throughout the United States, and wherever he went, he charmed. To the dismay of his Secret Service people, he liked to get close to the public, where he could be seen and touched. They say that up close, he radiated a kind of life force that stirred hope in people. Though scholarly at times, Kennedy was never stuffy. In fact, he liked nothing better than to poke fun at rituals, and he did so with a great sense of wit. Like the time he, a Harvard man, was to receive an honorary degree from his rival school, Yale.
It might be said now that I have the best of both worlds, a Harvard education and a Yale degree.
But some still questioned this charming preppy's ability to handle. Kennedy's first venture into foreign affairs seemed to confirm these doubts. The American-backed invasion of Castro's Cuba at the Bay of Pigs was a complete disaster. Surprisingly, the fiasco didn't hurt Kennedy's popularity ratings. Pierre Salinger, Kennedy's former press secretary, remembers the president's wry sense of irony.
I mean, I remember very well, about 2 weeks after the Bay of Pigs, there was a Gallup poll that came out showing 80% popularity, somewhere in that figure, very high. And I remember walking down the corridor with Kennedy, and he turned to me and said, I hope I don't have to keep doing stupid mistakes like that to keep my popularity up in the polls. I think one of the reasons that he got such a popular response was that he went forward and took full responsibility for the Bay of Pigs himself.
Kennedy's strong sense of personal responsibility would come into play again during the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. With Soviet nuclear missile sites discovered only 90 miles away in Cuba, Kennedy faced the most difficult decision of his life. He met secretly with his top advisors and received a range of attacking and possibly launching a nuclear war. He knew that the fate of the world hung on his shoulders alone.
One of the meetings came to an end, and I walked towards the president's office with him, and he turned to me, he said, I wonder if those people in there realize that if we make a mistake, hundreds of millions of people might be killed. He was very much aware of the danger that was involved in this whole operation.
Over the objections of several advisors, Kennedy chose a prudent and restrained course of action.
To halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. All ships of any kind bound to Cuba, from whatever nation or port, where they're found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back.
It was a wise decision. The Soviet ships turned back and the crisis ended. But it also showed Kennedy was a strong leader who could withstand pressure from within his own administration. In this interview, conducted several months after the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy spoke candidly about what he learned about presidential leadership and responsibility.
Well, I think that, well, you know, that old story about Abraham Lincoln in the cabinet. He says, all in favor say aye, and the whole cabinet voted aye, and all opposed no, and Lincoln voted no, and he said the vote is no. So that naturally the Constitution places the responsibility on the president.
Highly popular and tested by... The place is Dallas, Texas, the date November 22nd, 1963. As usual, it was the Kennedy style to be visible to the people. And he ordered that the bulletproof dome not be placed on his car. Moments after this footage was... It was a scenario that didn't seem to fit. Kennedy's image was all about vitality, youth, plans for the future. His death seemed impossible to accept. Not since William McKinley had a president been assassinated, and never had a presidential funeral been seen by so many people. To this day, the majority of Americans living at the time can death. To the vacuum of Kennedy's death was Lyndon Baines Johnson.
I will do my best. I ask for your help and God's.
Like Kennedy, Johnson saw himself as a crusader of social justice.
We are going to build a great society where no man or woman are the victim of fear or poverty or hatred.
But from a stylistic point of view, the Johnson image was something entirely new. Called by some a charming bully, Lyndon Johnson was the first real Texas cowboy to occupy the White House. And he went at the presidency like he went at everything else, with Johnson didn't walk so much as trot. He kept a frenetic work schedule and expected the same of everyone else. Johnson campaigned harder than any president in recent memory. He especially loved to press the flesh, as he put it. At the end of a campaign day, his hands were sometimes soon learned that if they wanted a story, they'd better bring their walking shoes, because the new president was always on the move. Even his wife, Lady Bird, had to struggle to keep up with him. Lady Bird knew better than anyone how demanding Johnson could be. He often told her what to wear. He put her to work beautifying America. And one time, he embarrassed her on national television by picking lint off her dress. But Johnson couldn't help being Johnson. He was loud and brash, with a folksy charm. A big man with huge appetites who didn't mind showing his more crude side to the cameras. He thought nothing of eating with his hands at his daughter's wedding, then wiping his hands on his tuxedo. Or picking his nose during a speech. Enraged dog lovers throughout the world when he picked up his pet beagle by the ears. But no one who knew him took Johnson for a fool. He had a razor-sharp mind and an instinct for politics that made him one of the shrewder who understood the power of television, portraying his opponent, Barry Goldwater, as a
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
These are the stakes. To make a world in which all of God's children can live, or to go into the dark. We must either love each other or we must die.
Vote for President Johnson on November 3rd.
He won by a landslide. When it came to getting his programs through Congress, the Johnson style was as the consummate arm twister. He would hug and flatter, cajole, and talk non-stop until he is getting a taste of Johnson's up-close approach. No wonder Johnson used to say, "I don't get ulcers, I give them." His many-tacked landmark legislation on civil rights, poverty, and education was already working on the next. Listen closely, and you'll hear LBJ at work.
Stay on that thing you're working on. Let's try to find an answer.
I think I've got an answer if I can talk to you today.
Let's see. Be sure to call Ms. Lehman now. Get the resolution in. Tell her you'll say a word about it yourself. What's that? Tell her it's necessary.
Johnson was still going full throttle. He had no patience for golf and tennis, but loved sports that provided speed and adventure, and a sense of danger. Johnson also loved the pressures of being president. After his first year in office, he said his biggest worry was that he'd run out of problems to solve. Even Vietnam seemed simple to him. We just go in and nail the coonskin to the wall, as he put it. The more fall back on his cowboy roots, lapsing into a defiant Texan drawl.
If this little nation goes down the drain and can't maintain her independence, ask yourself what's going to happen to all the other little nations.
In the spring of 1965, the verge of collapse. And the president says, I feel like a hitchhiker caught in a hailstorm on a Texas highway. I can't run, I can't hide, and I can't make it stop.
To Johnson, backing down from a fight was a sign of cowardice, and he could not bear to think of himself as the only president to lose a war. No one or nothing was going to change his mind about Vietnam. But his bullying style wouldn't work this time, as passionate opposition to the war intensified in the streets and campuses of America. By 1967, Johnson found himself a veritable prisoner in the White House, hunkered down, as he put it. LBJ was not the kind of man who liked to be pushed around, and when he saw that things weren't going to work his way, he decided to take matters into his own hands. On March 31st, 1968, LBJ prepared to give a televised address. Reporters had been told in advance that the subject would be Vietnam, but Johnson made a surprise announcement.
I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
Some presidents have grown in office. Others have failed to adapt. Johnson's high-spirited determination pushed many reforms through the political machinery. But in the end, the rancorous Western-style politics of Lyndon Johnson proved to be inflexible and therefore ill-suited to the global realities of his own time. Early in his first term, the next president, Richard Milhous Nixon, commented to a friend, "You think of Truman as a fighter, Eisenhower a good man, Kennedy charisma, Johnson. Of all the presidents, Richard Nixon remains one of the most enigmatic." Sometimes brilliant, other times petty and self-defeating, Nixon was the consummate political opportunist, always at work trying to control public opinion.
Ladies and gentlemen, Senator Richard Nixon.
My fellow Americans.
From early in his career, it seemed Nixon was defending his integrity. As a vice presidential candidate in 1952, he was accused of improperly using campaign funds. In this televised self-defense, Nixon showed a flair for the theatrical, describing himself as an honest but misunderstood patriot.
Why do I feel so deeply? Why do I feel that in spite of the smears, the misunderstanding, the necessity for a man to come up here and bare his soul as I have, why is it necessary for me to continue this fight? And I want to tell you why. Because, you see, I love my country.
Nixon later admitted that it was all an act, but back in the age of television innocence, he was a big hit, and he got to stay on the ticket. But Nixon found he couldn't always control the image he portrayed on television. In the 1960 presidential debate, have cost him the election. To run for president in 1968, and this time he was ready for television.
I think that what has happened through the years is that I have used the medium a great deal more. I think using it in a conversational way as we're using it today, and recognizing that when you're speaking before a rally crowd that you've got to zero it into the television crowd of that person in the rally.
And while we're ahead, let me make one thing very clear. We're taking nothing for granted. We're going to sock it to them from now throughout the balance of the campaign.
If Nixon grew depressed and suspicious in times of defeat, he could be utterly charming when things went his way.
Having lost a close one 8 years ago and having won a close one this year, I can say this: winning's a lot more fun.
Nixon saw himself as a Woodrow Wilson type, and he even had Wilson's desk moved into his office. In paying tribute to Wilson, Nixon might well have been thinking about how he himself wanted to be remembered.
The time will come when Woodrow Wilson will be remembered not as a man who tried and failed, but as one of those Americans who saw the truth before his time and whose vision became the reality of the generation he inspired.
But Nixon wasn't willing to let others write his own legacy. He wanted to do it himself. He once sent a memo to his daughter outlining anecdotes she should tell about how her father played the piano at her birthday parties and was an overall fun guy. The truth is, Nixon's style was stiff. He always looked a little uncomfortable at play and relaxation. When he went sailing, he went in long pants. And when he walked on the beach, it was often in his business shoes. And while he did enjoy a good round of golf, he was known to bring work with him on the course. Nixon's fierce control extended to family outings as well. They were often staged to show that he was a wholesome family man. And he used his daughter as a model for the younger generation, quiet, docile, and obedient to her dad. But with the continuing war in Vietnam and anti-war demonstrations sweeping the nation, young America was anything but docile. Nixon tried to control this, too, by sending out the police and the National Guard. He viewed the protesters as personal enemies, and his speeches began to once again take on a defensive, paranoid edge.
The terrorists, the far left, would like nothing better than to make the President of the United States a prisoner in the White House. Well, let me just set them straight. As long as I am president, no band of violent thugs is going to keep me from going out and speaking with the American people whenever they want to hear me and whenever I want to go.
Where he went was communist China, in what some have called the public relations coup of the century. The ever-resourceful Nixon knew that the television coverage of his trip would be extensive and would help shift attention away from dissension at home in an election year. The trip also helped lead the way to a U.S.-Soviet arms treaty, SALT I, a major accomplishment of the Nixon administration.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
Nixon won the election of 1972, but he would soon be faced with a crisis of his own making, one that he could no longer control. The Watergate hearings revealed that Nixon himself had tried to cover up a score of illegal government activities, including break-ins and wiretaps, to ensure his own victory in 1972. Once again, Nixon found himself defending his integrity on television.
Justice. And I think, too, that I can say that in my years of public life, that I welcome this kind of examination, because people have got to know whether or not their president is a crook. Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
But this time, the evidence against him was too great, and it became clear that if Nixon didn't resign, he would be impeached. The date is August 8, 1974. In what must have been the saddest moment of his professional life, Nixon was still trying to control the camera crew in the White House.
That's enough. Thanks. My friend Ollie, he wants to take a lot of pictures. I'm afraid he'll catch me picking my nose.
Image-conscious and controlling to the end, Nixon was about to do what no president before him had ever done.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office.
Do solemnly swear.
I, Gerald R. Ford, do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully execute.
That I will faithfully.
Gerald Ford was the nation's first appointed president. With public distrust of government at an all-time high, he was to play the role of national healer.
To the best of my ability.
My fellow Americans, our long national nightmare is over.
The Ford style was, in a word, unpretentious. The story goes that when Ford's dog made a mess on the floor one night, the new president stopped a White House attendant from cleaning it up and did the job himself. No man, said Ford, should have to clean up after another man's dog. They called him Good Old Jerry, Mr. Nice Guy, and the Boy Scout in the White House. I am, he once admitted, disgustingly sane. And for a seasoned politician, he had remarkably few enemies. But to many, Jerry Ford just didn't look, well, presidential. His style in office seemed dull and uninspiring. And the press often accused him of trying to act the part of a president. Ford sometimes tried. Jokes were often duds.
Bill, I'm sure you will make an excellent president. You're vigilant, you're alert, and you have a far-reaching vision. Then again, that's what they said about the lookout at Pearl Harbor.
Ford was also given to gaffes. The worst one came in the Ford-Carter debates of 1976.
There is no Soviet domination of Eastern Europe, and there never will be under a Ford administration.
The more Ford tried to clarify his statement, the deeper in he got.
I don't believe that the Romanians consider themselves dominated by the Soviet Union. I don't believe that the Poles consider themselves dominated by the Soviet Union.
He later admitted that he hadn't expressed himself clearly.
Autonomous.
But when it came to athletics, no president since Teddy Roosevelt was as gifted as Gerald Ford. A former college football player, he was an excellent swimmer, skier, golfer, and tennis player. But on a rainy day in 1975, while coming off a plane in Austria, Ford slipped and fell. He was okay, but the legend of the clumsy president was born. Now the press watched closely for every, whoops, stumble. And they eagerly reported on every, spill that Ford took. The president handled his new image with good-natured amusement and solid sportsmanship. He even invited the press to watch him ski, knowing full well that a fall would be front-page news.
Well, I just wanted to show you that I could get down a pretty steep incline without falling on my face. Of course, I do it occasionally.
Part of Ford's nice guy image came from his pragmatic, non-controversial approach to politics. When he decided to grant an unconditional pardon to Richard Nixon in September of 1974, he considered it a simple matter of common sense.
I think that in taking the action I did concerning those charges, I was exercising in a proper way the pardon authority given a president under the Constitution.
But the majority of Americans disagreed with the pardon, and the easygoing, pragmatic Ford found himself in the center of an angry controversy. But Ford continued to apply his nice guy approach to the problems of the day, which were dominated by the economy.
My conclusions are very simply stated. There is only one point on which all advisors have agreed. We must whip inflation right now.
Few, it had little real substance, and some dismissed it as a public relations gimmick. Try as he might, Ford could not steer clear of trouble. In April of 1975, Saigon fell to the communists, and all the Americans could do was stand by and watch. It was a humiliating moment for the United States, and the nice guy president appeared to be a powerless commander-in-chief.
The President of the United States.
But through it all, Ford remained a stolid optimist. He was eager to win the election of 1976 and finally become an elected president. He was beaten by a narrow margin.
I'd like to read you the telegram the President sent to President-elect Carter this morning.
Too hoarse from campaigning to speak, Ford listened stone-faced as his wife read the concession letter to Carter. And then, in a rare moment of emotional expression, Gerald Ford revealed how much he had wanted to continue being president.
Page of the Atlanta Constitution that said Jimmy Carter is running for what? And the what?
When he entered the race for president in 1976, the question on everybody's mind was...
Jimmy who?
Jimmy Carter.
Jimmy who?
I don't know who he is.
Jimmy Carter's baseball player, isn't he?
He's a people's man.
Yeah, I think he has a nice smile.
I heard he was a peanut farmer.
With roots in Plains, Georgia, Jimmy Carter was the first president from the deep rural South since old Zach Taylor. Carter was a peanut farmer, as well as a born-again Southern Baptist. His critics said he had the weirdo factor. But Carter's distance from Washington politics would be an advantage in the wake of the Watergate scandals.
And everybody
His
has
wife,
always known
Rosalind, summed up his
everything I did.
appeal during the campaign.
And Jimmy has never had any hint of scandal in his personal or his public life. I really believe he can restore that honesty, integrity, openness, confidence in government that we so sorely need.
I, Jimmy Carter, do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully execute.
Ford may have been the Boy Scout, but Carter seemed like a humble preacher, eager to bless and absolve his new congregation.
And I have just taken the oath of office on the Bible my mother gave me just a few years ago, opened to a timeless admonition from the ancient prophet Micah.
Above all, Carter saw himself as a common man, closer to the American people than to the special interests of Washington. He demonstrated this right away by walking to his inauguration, just as Thomas Jefferson had so long ago. Carter made other unusual gestures, like inviting ordinary citizens to meet with him in the White House. Here he chats with a farmer.
Just stay right in there.
I will. Well, anytime you want to contact me, write me a note and send it up here, or either come to see me directly.
To keep in touch with all Americans, Carter brought back the fireside chat, an informal broadcast from the White House library.
Deciding how I can be a good president. This talk, which the broadcast networks have agreed to bring to you, is one of several steps that I will take to keep in close touch with the people of our country.
And to the press, Carter promised a new era of openness and honesty.
Thank you very much. My intention is to have press conferences like this twice a month, and I look forward to those confrontations with the press to kind of balance up the nice and pleasant things that come to me as president.
Carter often invited the press down to Plains, his hometown, where they could watch a presidential softball game.
We got this one. Let's see, I tell you. Whoa!
And cool off with some homegrown Jimmy Carter watermelon. Carter wanted to be seen not only as a common man, but also as a solid family man.
To the base point.
He even did homework with his daughter Amy.
Oh, 10.
Okay.
He viewed his wife Rosalind's opinion on most matters. But the one feature of Carter that reveals the most about his style is that famous smile. They say he actually had two smiles, the good one, when he was genuinely happy, and the bad one, when he was angry or defensive. Because under that humble veneer, there was a fiercely competitive man who preferred to do things himself and had difficulty relating to other people. He practically ran the White House single-handedly, involved in the tiniest details, like who was using the tennis courts. Some say this micro style of management caused him to lose sight of the big picture. In Congress, for instance, where personal alliances are crucial to a president's success, he failed to cultivate a single close friend.
I promised you a president who is not isolated from the people, who feels your pain and who shares your dreams, and who draws his strength and his wisdom from you.
And his common man approach to problems often seemed indecisive and inadequate. When he pleaded with Americans to conserve energy, the gas lines just got longer and the tempers shorter.
Well, I would say everything's good in America, but I wouldn't say anything good about him. He makes promises and never keeps them. And I think he's better a preacher than he is a president.
The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 was a slap in the face to Carter, and the Iran hostage crisis made matters worse for Carter's image. It seemed that America, under his weak leadership, was being walked on. This was compounded by Carter's aborted rescue mission, which ended in disaster when a returning plane and helicopter collided while taxiing on the Iranian desert, killing 8 men. Despite his image problems, Carter remained convinced that he would have the support of the people in the election of 1980. But in the debates, his opponent, Ronald Reagan, asked one provocative question.
Are you better off than you were 4 years ago?
The answer appeared to be no, as Carter lost by a large margin. Highly intelligent and scrupulously honest, Carter's common man style, which made him an attractive candidate earlier, could no longer support his presidency. He left office an unhappy man, and a truthful one.
I promised you 4 years ago that I would never lie to you, so I can't stand here tonight and say it doesn't hurt.
I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear
that I will.
In 1980, Americans wanted a leader who would make them feel good again.
that I will faithfully execute
Ronald
the
Reagan
office of
did just
President
that.
of the United States.
He vowed to bring back the spirit of greatness and innocence America had felt before the Vietnam War and the Watergate scandals.
Let us renew our determination, our courage, and our strength. And let us renew our faith and our hope. We have every right to dream heroic dreams.
To signal a change from the homespun style of Carter, the Reagans held the most lavish, expensive inaugural in American history. And from day one, it seemed that history was on Ronald Reagan's side.
Some 30 minutes ago, the planes bearing our prisoners left Iranian airspace and are now free of Iran.
Many felt that Reagan restored a sense of grandness to the presidency that was missing in the Carter years.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
Unlike both Carter and Ford, Reagan knew how to look and sound presidential. But on March 30th, 1981, it almost came to an early end. An attempted assassination of Reagan came close to succeeding. But Reagan emerged with such good spirits, humor, and personal optimism that Americans loved him all the more.
When Reagan came into office, the affection was there that Eisenhower had, but there was no sense of personal courage. The shooting changed that. People saw Reagan with all of the handlers and the PR masters and everything like that stripped away. They saw him as he truly was. They had a glimpse of him as true character, and I think they felt that there was a man with true grit.
Reagan was the first Hollywood actor to enter the White House.
Well, I guess that's all, Mrs. Nelson. I just wondered if there was anything I could do.
No, Johnny.
He was never considered a great actor, but his movie background would come in handy as president. He'd often quote lines from popular films to help make his points.
Yes, and that...
I have only one thing to say to the tax increasers. Go ahead, make my day. As they said in the film, Back to the Future, where we're going, we don't need roads.
Reagan was a master of delivery, as long as he had a script. But watch what happened to him in Europe the day the teleprompter
40
failed.
years ago, they swarmed onto the boulevards of Paris, rallied under the Arc de Triomphe, and sang the Marseillaise. They were out there in the open and free
With the script in front of him again, he's back in top form. At age 69, Reagan was one of the oldest men to become president, but he never viewed his age as a limitation. Here, he speaks to an organization of elderly people.
Thank you very much. I was thinking of how I was going to begin my remarks here. I started thinking about my feelings on age, and they can be summed up by this greeting. Hi, kids.
And when his own age became an issue in the 1984 debates with Walter Mondale, he diffused it with a swift, razor-sharp one-liner.
I will not make age an issue of this campaign. I am not going to exploit, for political purposes, my opponent's youth and inexperience.
Reagan easily won re-election in 1984. Americans found comfort in his optimism, especially in times of crisis and disaster. When the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded in 1986, stunned Americans took strength from Reagan's fatherly attitude.
And I want to say something to the school children of America who were watching the live coverage of the shuttle's takeoff. I know it's hard to understand, but sometimes painful things like this happen. The future doesn't belong to the faint-hearted. It belongs to the brave.
He became a father figure, I think, for much of the country, and that helped him. You know, your father, you know, the thing about being a father figure, which I think Reagan became in those early years, is that your father may make mistakes, but you still love him. And I think that happened to Reagan.
But Reagan's age and easygoing style had its downside. Stories about Reagan's work style made many Americans wonder if he was really in control, like the time he dozed off during a meeting with the Pope. Or when his wife had to coach him on what to say about getting the Soviets back to the negotiating table.
Doing everything we can.
Doing everything we can.
Thank you, sir.
It also bothered many that Reagan took more vacations than any modern president. Reagan became so sensitive to this criticism that he took to carrying a briefcase whenever he returned from vacation. Reagan's hands-off management style raised questions about whether he was alert enough to be president.
I've been reading a great deal about my management style. I think that most people in business will agree that it is a proper management style. You get the best people you can to do a job. Then you don't hang over their shoulder criticizing everything they do or picking at them on how they're doing it.
But many believed he wasn't paying enough attention to details. Like when his chief of staff, James Baker, and his Treasury Secretary, Donald Regan, decided on their own to switch jobs. It was okay with Reagan, but maybe it shouldn't have been. His new staff scheduled him to visit a German war cemetery where Nazi SS troops were buried. Then came the Iran-Contra affair.
We did not, repeat, did not trade weapons or anything else for hostages, nor will we.
But as the Iran-Contra hearings proceeded, it became clear that an arms for hostage deal had been made, and the profits were being illegally funneled to the Nicaraguan Contras. Even if Reagan knew nothing about it, the fact that the scheme was being run right out of the White House basement made him seem dangerously out of touch. The Iran-Contra affair hurt Reagan's effectiveness in his second term, but it never completely destroyed the affection that Americans held for him. In the end, the actor with the reassuring, fatherly style left office a satisfied man, something few past presidents could say.
My friends, we did it. We weren't just marking time. We made a difference. We made the city stronger, we made the city freer, and we left her in good hands. All in all, not bad. Not bad at all.
The hands Reagan was referring to are those of George Walker Bush, Reagan's loyal vice president for 8 years. Born into wealth and privilege and educated at Yale, Bush is in some ways the quintessential Eastern preppy.
You've seen the portraits of the Mayflower. My people are the ones way...
So calls himself a Texan who loves country music, pork rinds, and a good game of horseshoes. Bush campaigned by promising a sense of continuity.
When you have to change horses in midstream, doesn't it make sense to switch to one who's going the same way?
But Bush's own style would prove to be far less dogmatic and more compromising than Reagan's. Reagan spoke in mythic proportions.
In my mind, it was a tall, proud city built on rocks stronger than oceans, windswept, God-blessed, and teeming with people of all kinds living in harmony and peace.
I'm a practical man. I like what's real. I'm not much for the airy and abstract. I like what works.
Reagan spoke with religious zeal.
Can we begin in a moment of silent prayer?
Not George Bush.
I don't yearn to lead a crusade. My ambitions are perhaps less dramatic, but they're no less profound.
Reagan held news conferences against a backdrop of a red carpet, creating a sense of majesty and imperialism.
This relationship.
But Bush opted for what he called a natural style, making himself more accessible to the news media.
To those leaders and to the rest of the world, I may sometimes be a little awkward, but there's nothing, and I'm a quiet man, but I hear the quiet people, others don't. And I hear them, and I am moved, and their concerns are mine.
And so, in the year of George Washington's inaugural bicentennial, the torch of the presidency is passed on once again. The orderly transition of power from one president to another is the cornerstone of American democracy. It reminds us that the office of the presidency itself is greater than any one man who has passed through it.